So you probably know that a lot of marine life occurs in the coastal regions. So if tides are coming in and creating all these waves and complex patterns and flood currents and ebb currents and so on, you can imagine that some life forms which have lived there for a long time have probably evolved to either adjust to the tide cycle or use the tide cycle for some part of their life cycle. The example of Granian of California is a very good case to look at. It's a small silvery fish which can get about 6 inches long, and somehow they have evolved to sense the timing of the spring and neap tides. So they're out in the ocean, they know when the tide is coming, and they make their move towards the coast, and they get pretty far up onto the beach in the sand, and the female buries herself like this and lays the eggs. It's called spawning. Then the males come up behind her and they wrap their bodies around the female and release the milt, which is the seminal fluid which is required to fertilize the eggs. So here is the cycle being shown. Here is the new moon and the spring tide happening on the first day. On the subsequent days, the high tides get weaker and weaker as you go from the maximum new moon spring tide or the full moon spring tide and the following days as the moon's phase continues to change, right? So they come in and they use this decreasing high tide periods to go into the sand and release the eggs and wait for the males. In fact, if they don't see any male, they will go back and not release the eggs. They produce lots of eggs, and just after 1 year, they may live for several years, but just after 1 year, they're already ready to spawn or lay eggs. So it's a pretty fast life cycle, sexual maturity, and so on. So it's an amazing evolution. So here is the full moon example where the Granian come up the beach and lay the eggs, and the males come in and release the milt, and so on. So it's learned from laboratory experiments that the friction of the sand as the tides go back and forth is somehow essential for the eggs to hatch. So as the spring tide comes to an end, the eggs begin to hatch and the larvae of the fish begin to swim out into the ocean. So amazing that they have developed this sense to identify the timing and then use it for reproduction, right? Biology is always amazing. As the old saying goes, nature makes the rules and biology finds the loopholes, which means biology is always looking for a place where it can procreate and reproduce, even though conditions look harsh from the physical nature point of view in terms of temperatures, currents, tides, whatever. Okay? So we talked about ocean power from currents and from waves. Obviously, if tides carry a lot of energy, there has to be tide generated power as well. So tide power can be trapped one of two ways. As the flood tide happens, you can build a dam and trap the water behind some kind of a coastal barrier and then release it to turn the electrical turbines, or you can use the tidal currents that come into narrow channels similar to the current turbines that use directly the ocean currents. So if you imagine the Bay of Fundy, which has this meters and meters of amplification, it would be a good site for doing this kind of a tide generated power, but somehow that place has never installed power plants. Nonetheless, there are many places where tide power is being used. It has the same issue with other renewable power sources like solar, wind, currents, waves, that it's not a continuous source, it's a intermittent source. So tides have cycles, so the tide generation will have cycles as well. You need to transport the energy inland and so on. Plus there are lots of issues about what is called demand, power on demand. So if suddenly it gets very hot and let's say the coastal village needs power to run all the ACs, you cannot just summon the tidal power because the tides have to come in for that to happen. And there are also cases where it's found that the tidal disruption, tidal cycle disruption by the tide generating, the power generating installations can affect life, right? So we talked about the Granian. Imagine if you put something in the path of the Granian, which is using the spring tide, then you are going to disrupt the Granian life cycle, right? So the first Asian power plant was installed in 2006. UK has proposed building world's largest tidal power plant, and the power plant at La Rance, France, has been successfully producing tidal power since 1967. So it uses this kind of idea where you have the sea, the side towards the sea is here, and there is a coastal structure here, and there is a estuary on this side of this coastal structure, which you can see has a bridge like facility on top for traffic and so on. So during the rising tide, water is allowed to come on this side, and it is trapped behind this structure you see, and as the water comes in, it's going to turn the turbines and generate power. And again, as the tide goes out, so both the flood tide and the ebb tide are designed to turn the turbine. So usually turbines go one way when you have hydroelectric, but in this case they make it go both ways to produce power both in the in cycle and the out cycle. So there is the region of La Rance, France. Okay, so you can read up more about it. These are just meant to give you an introduction that tidal power is always there. It's a renewable resource. It has issues in terms of intermittency and so on, but nonetheless, there are power plants running. There are plans to install many more by UK, for example. So as we try to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, all these power sources matter, right? So this is a short chapter, just like the wave. So this is the last slide. I think I have some animations which I will show in the next podcast. So tides, very simple stuff, but make sure you understood all the concepts.